Welcome back to the Chad X podcast, guys. It's me, your host, Chad, and I'm here with that's right, two very special guests today. Number one, the usual, your favorite, my co host at this point, Ferris. Introduce yourself, Ferris.
Hey guys, it's me again.
And for our second guest, we got a very special one today. It's somebody new, somebody you haven't heard before, but I think you're going to love and really appreciate. It is our special guest, the expert on East African affairs, Mr. Salim.
Hey, my name is Salim. Nice to meet you guys. I hope we have a good conversation. Hope people are able to learn more about what's happening in Sudan through this conversation, inshallah.
Absolutely. So that's our goal for today. He kind of spoiled it, but I'm going to still go ahead and discuss it, set it up. We're going to be discussing specifically Sudan and the conflict that has been raging there. It's often described as a civil war. There have been other ways of describing it throughout the media, but we're going to stick to referring it as a civil war for the purposes of today's podcast. We're going to go over some of the details about the combatants, the history of the conflict, because it's been going on for a few years at this point. And some people would even say that it's been going on longer than the official records indicate, with the end of Omar al-Bashir when he was overthrown. Some people say that was the real first sign of instability in the nation when things started to fall apart. But we're going to go into some real detail and all that. I'm actually going to toss it to the expert at this point. He's going to give us all that background, and then we're going to go ahead and dive into what's happening today and how things are going as the war has officially started to wind down. So go ahead and take it from here, Mr. Salim.
Thank you very much. So, actually, the roots of this conflict can really be traced back to some people say during the 1980s, because when Gaddafi was the president of Libya, he wanted to empower the Arab tribes in the Sahel region, specifically Mali, Chad, and Western Sudan. So, he sort of created like a legion of armed rebels there and just sort of empowered them and decided, okay, you guys, I'm going to empower you. You basically act through me. I want to sort of unify the African Arab tribes of the Sahel, and you guys will act as my mercenaries in a bit, in a way. That is one, I guess you could say, root cause of this. But what really goes back to is during the time of the fake Mahdi in Sudan, and when his basically his support base, because the Mahdi, his support base was the Arab tribes of central and west, south central and western Sudan, and it goes back from that because when the Mahdi was recruiting people, it was mainly tribes from those regions of Sudan that decided to join his army, and not really the riverine tribes of northern and central Sudan, and not really the tribes of eastern Sudan as well. And because of this, they just feel some sort of superiority, some ethnic superiority towards the other tribes of Sudan, which kind of fuels the RSF genocidal agenda. Because if you see some of the videos of the RSF, you see them cursing Sibalin, which means Northerners. And when they're talking about Northerners, they're talking about North and Central Sudan. Because they feel marginalized. They feel that because historically, Sudan, since independence, since 1956, most, or actually not a single president, has been from outside of Northern Sudan.
And just to clarify for the audience there, the RSF is one of the groups, one of the main factions involved in the Civil War. They have their origins in the Janjaweed militias, which were, as previously stated, an Arab supremacist militia that operated mostly in the Darfur region of South Sudan. They are one of the main belligerents in this war. The other is the group that claims to be the inheritors of the Sudanese government. Is that
Yes.
correct?
So after the fall of Omar Bashir in 2019, the people weren't necessarily satisfied because I was in there in Washington D.C. with one of the protests, and we saw the protests live streamed on Sudanese media and global pan Arabic media as well. Just seeing a lot of it through social media, seeing firsthand accounts of what's going on, seeing posts on Facebook, seeing posts on WhatsApp group chats and Twitter. And one of the main goals of the revolution was not just to remove Omar Bashir. It was to have a democratic elected civilian government. One of the main slogans was Madaniya, which means in Arabic civil state, a civil state. That was one main important thing that was driving the revolution. And when he fell, when Omar Bashir when it was removed, he sort of handed the army was the ones who removed him. So he didn't step down. It was the army that stepped in and said, This isn't in the interest of the nation. We don't want a civil war to happen, so we're going to take over and we're going to replace him. And the people decided, no, that's not enough. Actually, the guy who replaced him, I think his name was Abdurrahman ibn Auf. He stepped down after like a day or two because the protests wouldn't stop when he took over. Because that was, again, that's not the goal. The goal isn't for military rule. The goal is to have civilian rule. And after that, there was still protests, mass popular demonstrations, and instability. And that didn't really get solved until, I'm going to say, August 2019 or July 2019, when the military and the main protesting faction, which I'll get to that later because this is important context for the war, the Freedom of Forces of Change, the FFC, they were sort of the unelected representatives of the Sudanese protesters of the Sudanese revolution because actually nobody sat down and said, we appoint these guys to speak on our behalf. Nobody went to voting polls. They just sort of usurped the power. They were sort of the most organized anti-military government body at that time. So people reluctantly decided to just go with it, not really question it. So they sought to seek a deal to undercut the civilians and what they want and look out for their own interests politically. So they decided to come to a compromise with the military regime. They said, we want to rule, but you guys can rule as well. So let's do a joint transitional council. So it was called the Transitional Sovereignty Council. That's still the official name of the Sudanese government today. That hasn't changed since 2019. And the problem with this was because those groups were sort of backed by one militia, and then other political factions in the transitional government were backed by the army, the official army, the Sudanese armed forces. And at first, everything was fine. There wasn't really tension between the two. But then I want to stay after 2021 when before the appointed prime minister was Abdullah Hamdok. He was appointed in 2019. He was chosen by the Freedom Forces of Change. He actually had been removed before. He was removed in a coup, and Abdul Fattah al-Burhan, which is the president of the Sovereignty Council, who's the president of Sudan and the commander of the armed forces, he did a sit-down interview with Al Jazeera, and he said that he believes this was a correction of the course of the revolution. He believed that the transitional government at the time, under Hamdok's leadership, had steered away from the goals of the revolution, and he believed that the army's role is to be protectors of the nation and protectors of the revolution. And because of this, they instigated a coup and removed him from the power, and the power was just held by the army temporarily. And then later they reached a deal with Abdullah Hamdok to return under the condition that there will be no more military interference in the transitional government. They said, okay, that's fine. And then they said, we're also going to go back to the original deal, which was after 2 years, there's an election because that was originally what they agreed upon in 2019, but they kept delaying this. Every single time they got close to elections, they said, okay, we're not ready. Let's just push this back even further. So that's what they agreed upon. And then I want to say he continued for a couple of more months after that. And he just quit. And he quit because he said that the army was undermining their agreement to not interfere in politics and that he was done with them. And he couldn't operate under those conditions set by the army. So after that, there were some mass demonstrations, but not as much as the 2019 revolution. So the government was sort of stuck in a transitional phase that wasn't really a transitional phase as well. It's just like, we're going to call it a transitional phase, but we're not going to really do anything to actually get onto the roadmap of democracy. So there's negotiations here and there trying to figure out who's going to be the next prime minister or the members of the Transitional Sovereignty Council. And just a lot of Sudanese parties are just sort of forming their own groups. The FFC actually split into two. It's the sorry, give me 1 second. I know it's the FFC
And just to make sure we're
Democratic Bloc, and then the FFC. Um, there's another one as well,
and
but
just
they
to,
split into two. Yeah.
just to make sure we're keeping the timeline straight here. This is all happening about 3 years after the initial 2019 ousting, and
Yes, this is. 2021, 2022. So this is before the war happens.
Got it. Okay, so we're
So we're sort of stuck between the political quarreling between the FFC factions, which now have split. So in 2019, they were all sort of unified, and then they have split.
got it. So we're seeing the fracturing of the opposition develop at this point.
Yes, the traditional opposition has been fractured and splintered.
All right. At this point, so you would say Abdel Fattah, the previous individual who sort of tried to appoint himself as the leader of the opposition as a whole, expressed his discomfort with the military and their interference in the political affairs of the civilians who wanted to create a civilian-led government. He stepped down,
Yes,
and in his absence, that power vacuum that sort of develops in the civilian side of things, we start to see different, would you say, almost militia groups develop, or are they still political groups just
yes.
with
Actually,
militant
yes, they
wings?
were militia groups because one of the things in Sudan is a lot of the some of the political parties had become stemmed from militias as well. This is due to the, I believe, 2020, 2021, the Juba Peace Agreement. This was signed between all of the previous warring or most of the previous warring factions that went to war with the government under Omar Bashir's reign. These were ethnic and tribal militias in western and southern Sudan as well. And they sort of they came to agreement. They said, we're going to integrate into the government. We're going to become political parties. We want this many allocated shares and seats into the transitional government. In exchange, we will lay down arms and we will integrate into the army. And this agreement is important because everyone signed on to this. Everyone agreed upon it. And during the time of the quarreling, the political quarreling for like 1 or 2 years, people are using that as an excuse to not fully integrate into one single professional national army. And that's what eventually leads to the RSS rebellion. So this is 2023. There was a deadline set for, so they had come to an agreement, all the parties, all the people involved in transitional government, they had sort of set a agreement. They said, okay, this is the deadline to sign the agreement. And everyone agreed to it. And the RSF, I think that on the deadline or the day before, reneged on the agreement and then they instigated the civil war.
Got it. So they were originally signatories of this agreement, and then they backed out.
Yes, and they purposely stalled so they didn't have to become part of the army because if they stall and don't become part of the army, they can say, okay, this government lacks legitimacy because there is no real government, and that's what they say now. In fact, they even set up a parallel government in Nairobi, Kenya, and they had the ceremony a few months ago.
Interesting. Got it. And this is all got it. So we got all the background there on sort of the pre-war period. That's a lot to digest. I appreciate that. We're gonna take a little
Yeah,
pause right here so we can sort of break down. I want the audience to have time to digest that, and I also just want to just really raise a few points of my own. There's a few things I didn't quite know there. So number one was the thing you pointed out that you said really the origin of this conflict. You should really go back to the 1980s with Gaddafi, and a lot of people Gaddafi is sort of in the public consciousness of people who are
yeah,
politically aware and aware of international events. But a lot of people think
yes,
of him for his later ventures into the Pan Africanist ideals. A lot of people don't realize that early in his career as a leader, he was more of a Pan Arabist. And you mentioned the fact that he was trying to unite the tribes of Libya, Chad, Mali, and Western Sudan. A lot of people don't realize that he had this brief stint where he wanted to be a Pan Arabist before he realized that he was unlikely to achieve the level of power he wanted to using that ideology, and sort of pivoted to a more pan-Africanist ideal. Also, a lot of people just don't realize the country of Chad, even though it is a predominantly sub-Saharan black African ethnic country, there are significant amounts of Arabs as a minority in that nation. So the relationship between them and some other of the northern Central African countries is a complex one. There's the francophone influence and the fact that they are a former French colony. There's the fact that they are a country with significant Arab minorities, but a non-Arab majority. And also the fact that of all the nations in Central Africa, they're one of the most unified and cohesive militarily. They have been since their former president Idris Deby was in charge, and his son, having taken over now as a dictator, he has kept them still as a formidable military threat in the nation. They collaborate closely with France, which gives them access to certain resources that other countries in the region and other militia groups maybe don't have access to. Just all around, it's a very complex web of entanglements going on there in Africa, and it has been for decades. But it's really interesting to think that some of the roots of this conflict, because a lot of people, are aware that the RSF has its roots in the Janjaweed Arab supremacist militias
Yes.
that occupied southern Sudan, but the fact that even those militias had their roots earlier in being funded as part of some of these armed Arabist groups that Gaddafi was funding is it just goes to show how deep some of the roots of this conflict can go, and ethnic conflict in general. Your thoughts, Ferris? Want to make sure you get a chance to weigh in on anything that you found interesting about that breakdown we just got.
Okay, so from you guys basically said everything, and explained it really well. So I wanted to first congratulate you two. You guys are doing a really good job explaining it for the people. Uh,
Appreciate that. Thank you.
because it's a deeply complex if people don't understand it. Because like for example, when I first heard about what's going on in Sudan, I didn't fully was aware of, and I didn't have anybody tell me as much until I did some research on it.
Well, if I may
So,
interject just real briefly, I
mhm,
also was under the assumption it was just a war of two generals in the beginning. So I was sort of neutral because I myself have my grievances with the Sudanese army,
mhm,
and I also have to agree with the RSF as well. So I was sort of neutral. I was sort of thinking, okay, this is a war between two corrupt generals. I can't take either side because traditionally the politics I align with and my family aligns with are anti-military, but
yep,
also anti-genocide, anti-Janjaweed as well. So we felt
mhm,
it had to be neutral. And it wasn't
yep,
really until I read a lot of tweets and threads from a Twitter user. I think his at is Mohamed Al Balal. He's a really
mhm,
good guy. You guys, everyone should follow him if you are on Twitter. He
mhm,
explains the conflict really well, and he sort of explained why that I should support the military as a matter of principle and not and sort of just overlook my grievances temporarily and
mhm,
look at it for the sake of preservation of the unity of the nation. Because one of the things that the RSF and their supporters do is they use the term State 56, which is sort of mocking the idea of the national border, the national sovereign state of Sudan from 1956 until its existence. Because the
mhm,
RSF is comprised of not just Sudanese people as well, but ethnic Arab tribes, ethnic
mhm.
Arabs from the Sahel region. So they span from Mali, Nigeria, and the Chad and the Central African Republic as well.
Thank you for explaining that, Goteba. So for me, how I say like to very simplify it to me, for my the RSF is known as the bad guys. If you want people want to know, it's like simplicity. To me, they're known as the bad guys. And another thing
Yes.
I like to bring up, funny coincidence, but it's the truth. If you see any country that the UAE supports, just know they're probably bad. They're probably bad.
That's
So
true.
that's how I see it. I'll be honest with you, because they don't do anything to help people. They always infiltrate, and I can go on a rant regarding to them specifically, but I'll choose that for another day. I don't want to get us deplatformed or banned.
Yeah.
Yeah. So well, we said a lot of stuff that probably could get us deplatformed one day, but the
Yeah.
theme of this channel really is how do things that are being done by the older generation impact the youth? And your breakdown really helps tie that together to the theme of this channel because it seems like the leaders of this, on both sides, but especially on the RSF, they trace their authority back to the 1980s, a period of time before many of the fighters in this war and people who are suffering from under this war were even born. I mean, Sudan is one of the younger countries in the world, but in Africa, there's the population in general is so much younger. The average age of a person in the United States is close to 40. The average age of a person in sub-Saharan Africa is close to 15. So a lot of these people who are suffering as a result of these conflicts and these power struggles, and even if there's people out there who aren't as clear cut on the issue of don't support genocidal Arab supremacist militias, if you still view this as just a power struggle between two different anti-democratic groups, you still should feel for the people on the ground because the people at the top who are benefiting from this or attempting to benefit and gain control and power over the people in this region are people who have been around since Gaddafi was on the come up as a leader in Africa. They're people who were making moves and machinations politically back in the 1980s you should, if you are someone who believes in empowering and supporting the youth, what you should want obviously is a civilian government so that the masses of young people in Sudan and in other countries in this region are able to have their voices heard and get policies passed that can help them achieve more in life and have a better quality of life. So ultimately, I think the number one thing to gain from the background we've just been provided generously by Mr. Salim for our viewers of this channel is wars in a lot of countries around the world, but especially in countries that are impoverished or lower economically than a lot of other nations in the world, will always have a disproportionately negative impact on the young. The young are the ones who fight the wars, and they're usually not the ones who benefit from the arms manufacturing, the arms trafficking, the accrual of more power and more territory. That's always going to be old people just trying to use us as young people as pawns in their own endeavors. Your thoughts on that thought, guys?
It also doesn't just go back to Gaddafi. That's really just the modern origins of the Janjaweed. But even that, the ideology of their supremacy, of their Arab supremacy, traces back to the Mahdist period of Sudan, where the Mahdists, they recruited primarily from the Baggara Arab tribes. And that tribal confederation is the Federation of Arab Tribes in the Sahel region. And it's not in Sudan, it's also in Chad, it's in South African Republic, it's in Mali, it's in Nigeria as well. And just that sort of region, those guys, specifically in Sudan and Western Sudan and South Central Sudan, they were recruited and they were part of the support base of the Mahdi. And what happened was they sort of went around and tried to turn Sudan into a Islamic Mahdi state under the fake Mahdi. I call him fake Mahdi because I don't believe that he aligns with the traditional Islamic view of who the Mahdi is. And they went around not just waging war, but also occupying regions that don't belong to them or their tribal home or their tribal homeland. And they just took over took over homes, took over everyone's home, and they committed genocidal acts as well against the other tribes because the other tribes sided with the British and they felt that was treachery for them to side with the British against their own brethren. And that sort of grudge carries over into the modern day as well. Some of them feel like people from the tribes that did not join the Mahdist Revolution are collaborators with the British and that they're not loyal to the nation and that they don't have the right to rule. And these people have more of a right to rule than we do.
Well, I was thinking it's a war for old people because it goes back to having roots in the 1980s. But you're talking about a struggle that took place in the 1880s. So yeah,
Yeah, and what makes matters worse is the tribal elders from those tribes are not just fanning the flames of the war, but they have given clear support to the RSF. There is multiple videos of them declaring allegiance to the Rapid Support Forces. It's been very clear that they believe that this is a tribal ethnic war, despite what the UAE and their affiliates in the media might tell you. They might tell you this is a war against the Muslim Brotherhood or this is a war against the Islamists. No, this is a tribal conflict backed by the UAE because they believe that this tribe will give them easier access to natural resources, which is primarily gold.
which
And using gold is how the RSF is able to recruit such a large network of foreign fighters.
definitely interesting. The foreign fighter is something that's been talked about by a lot of people who have been following this war. If you watch any videos, if you keep up with the news about things, it's this idea that the RSF is a foreign army, almost is how they're described, or a foreign militia attempting to assert dominance over Sudan. Even though several members of their leadership are Sudanese nationals, people who previously had close relations with Omar Bashir, the previous leader of Sudan, and his described either as a willingness to look over or us sort of undercover support for members of the Janjaweed and the other Arab supremacist militias who invaded Darfur and other areas of South Sudan and created regional instability by committing genocide against some of the non-Arab natives of that region. So it is really interesting to think about the fact that they're viewing this as an ethnic conflict to establish Arab supremacy in a country that's already, majority Arab, linguistically and ethnically. So it's just overall, it's a really interesting concept. So the war's been going on now for a few years, and based on new reports that are coming out about what territory is under whose control, who's winning what conflicts, what skirmishes, it does seem as if the war is beginning to wind down, and the RSF is in a losing position. They have not admitted defeat, and like you said, they just recently announced that they view themselves as the rightful inheritors of the transitional government. But the facts on the ground seem to imply that they are on the back foot at least. What can you tell us about that, Mr. Saleem?
So I can tell you that at the early stage of the war, it seemed that the army was more focused on not losing Khartoum, which is the capital city, which did not happen. They actually did lose it, and that strategy failed. So the capital, even now, is temporarily moved to Port Sudan, which is in eastern Sudan. And they sort of held a defensive position in the war, and they sort of decided to protect just the certain the what it seemed like they were more concerned protecting the traditional power bases of Sudan and the Sudanese government and the just where power has traditionally been held in north in the central country in central part of the country as well, and to a smaller degree the east as well, because some of the vice presidents have been from there. So it seemed like they were more concerned with protecting those areas of the country rather than protecting central and western Sudan, which have long been neglected, which adds the fuel to the fire, which is one of the grievances that the RSF has for, and one of the reasons they start the war. And I will admit that is a legitimate grievance. Those regions of Sudan have historically been underdeveloped, have been historically marginalized, not just by ethnic basis, because it happens to all ethnicities and all tribes in those regions of Sudan as well. So, team the army was more focused on protecting their traditional support base, and traditional power base, until I want to say very recently, 2024. They sort of went on offensive and they started clearing out the RSF held territories in Al Jazeera, which is in central Sudan, and Khartoum, which is also in central Sudan, but a little bit more to the north. And that resulted in the RSF being expelled completely from the Al Jazeera state and almost completely expelled from the Khartoum state, but expelled completely from Khartoum, the city.
Seems like that may have given fuel to the accusations that were previously leveled by the RSF and their supporters that the government was run by Northerners with only Northern interests in mind. The fact that they were sort of trying, the army leadership was sort of trying to consolidate their position around the territories that they had, you know, familial and regional ties to. Is that something that seems like an accurate assessment of it?
Because although the army itself is made up of people from all tribes, all ethnicities, and even religions, there's actually a probably a Coptic influencer in Sudan, and he's part of the army, and he's seen with the army. He's actually liberated a few mosques, and he's seen with them when they're chanting Allahu Akbar. It's sort of seen as a sign of unity, as hey, I'm Christian, but I'm still with my Muslim brothers because at the end of the day, we're both Sudanese, and this is our country. So yeah, the soldiers themselves are from all backgrounds of Sudan, but most of the senior leaders, although few of them are from Western Sudan, and some of them are from southern parts of Sudan as well, have traditionally been from the north, especially the ones who have become presidents of the country. All of them were from the north.
Got it. So that is something that the RSF
With the arts.
or the other militias could be using to try to propagandize against the current administration or the army led administration. It is interesting the idea that they're pulling on this nationalist trend, this idea of a national unity, of a national identity as Sudanese people that goes across religion, goes across ethnicities, and they're fighting against an Arab supremacist and ethnic supremacist militia. But at the same time, they're getting their own accusations of being, northern supremacists, regional supremacists, people who have only the thoughts and considerations of their own people who live in the areas they are from in mind. So both sides are having, these accusations levied against them. One of them, a little more credibly, it does seem the RSF, has its basis in these Arab supremacist militias. It's overall just such an interesting situation, and I mean, as an outside observer, it does seem to be that we should be grateful that the side that's winning is the one that is at least through its propaganda, through its messaging, trying to present an image of just nationalism as opposed to over, ethnic solidarity, ethnic supremacy, just coming together as one nation, recruiting people from various backgrounds. Ultimately, though, the only thing we can hope for is that the war ends quickly so that the people who have been ignored, the young people who have had their lives trampled and stepped on, and even older people. Let's be clear: everybody in this who is suffering, who doesn't have power, doesn't have weaponry, doesn't have access to protection that a certain level of wealth or connection can offer you. Those are the people who are losing the most in this war. Those are the biggest losers, and those are the people who only stand to win by the war ending. As of right now, though, we are trying to get a good idea of how things are going to pan out. Like you said, it seems as if previously they were trying to control the East, the army, and their groups, but they've recently begun their push and their offensive. What can you tell us about this recent offensive and these pushes they've taken to reclaim Khartoum and some of the other areas in central Sudan?
So, like I told you before, Khartoum is practically liberated. A lot of people have been returning from neighboring countries and even countries from the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, you name it. People have been returning home, especially to Khartoum, because that's where I think majority of the population of Sudan lives. And that's one of the free cities now. And after that, it's sort of right now they're just trying to clean out the remnants from the periphery of the city proper of Khartoum, sort of other cities in the state, and especially in the twin city of Omdurman, which is right across the river. And also they have sort of we can make an offensive into central Sudan, which is close, or southwest Sudan as well, just so they can sort of make a link between all they want to sort of link the east with Khartoum, and then through there they want to link it to the central Sudan, and they want to link it to the west. Because if they have control of those routes and they cut off the RSF supply routes, the RSF is sort of left shorthanded. You could actually follow Mohammed Al Bilal, like I said earlier. He explains this really well and in depth. And also the joint forces, which is who the so the majority of the army is actually in where I told you before, the central and northern and eastern parts of the country. But the southern and western parts of the country have armed allied forces. We call them the joint forces. Some of them are from the rebel groups that signed a Juba peace agreement back in 2020. And some of them are just ordinary civilians and volunteers from those ethnic groups that have been marginalized and targeted by the RSF. And they've been sort of on the defensive and not really offensive. They've sort of been repelling RSF attacks in the capital of North Darfur, which is Al Fashir, and repelling other attacks in the South Kordofan region as well.
So, based on the current rate
And
of progress that they've been pursuing and that they've been achieving in reclaiming Khartoum, reclaiming the surrounding areas, and starting this push that you're describing has been described to you to attempt to unify Eastern, Central, and Western Sudan under army leadership. What do you think is a reasonable timeline if everything continues the way it is to expect them to have completed that process or be at basically the point where that process can be completed and the supply chains can be cut off to RSF forces stationed throughout various points in the country?
okay, so based off the analysis from a lot of military analysts, journalists, and people familiar with the situation of Sudan, ordinary Sudanese civilians, Sudanese, and the diaspora who've taken upon themselves to really educate themselves on the war and sort of be the voice for the people that don't really know what's going on and simplify and break things down for us. A lot of their predictions are sort of 2 or 3 years the war is going to end, because the current trend is that the RSF is being pushed back into their tribal support base. And if the RSF can be contained there, then it seems that they'll eventually capitulate, and they're going to have either one choice. Either that choice is to completely disband, or if they don't disband, they're just going to get obliterated and it will cease to exist completely.
Good to know. Good to know. Well, that is positive news. Is the idea that we're gonna see something that looks like either an end to the war or an update on what our knowledge is of the situation on the ground and how things progress within a reasonable time frame. I think that's a pretty good point to end right there. Looking towards the future and what's going on. I just want to just go ahead and take a second here and get your final thoughts in. Ferris, you've been a little quiet. I know we've been going back
Yeah.
and forth a lot of information. Do you have any final thoughts on everything that we've learned here as a group today?
I say that my main thought is like I want to thank Salim for like educating us and letting our viewers know about the situation that's going on in Sudan. Uh, I wish nothing but the best, and hopefully the future of Sudan will be prosperous. And it seems like we're going to go head into the right direction. So let's hope it keeps going like that.
All right, perfect. Thank you for that thought. And once again, do you have any final thoughts or anything you want to share with us about the situation on the ground? Just anything you want, any message you want out to the final people, Mr. Salim.
So just want to clarify things. Like I mentioned earlier that I have my own grievances with the army, but in spite of that, I choose to support them. I think a lot of the Sudanese people are like this as well. There have been videos where you can see people from the Sudanese armed forces and any of the joint armed forces and any popular resistance committees and forces that are in the army. A lot of them are saying or heard chanting, "We are the sons of December," meaning that we are the ones that are part of the revolution. The revolution is they don't believe the revolution has ended. They believe this is a continuation of the revolution. They believe this is a correction of the course that the revolution is going upon. Because to many people, it seemed that the revolution had failed to achieve its goals because the economic situation has gotten worse. The political situation has been more unstable, and even the military and security situation has gotten worse as well since the revolution. So a lot of the people that were out on the ground protesting fiercely against army rule are the same ones who are joining the army today to defend the country from foreign influence and invasion.
Yeah, the revolution isn't over until the civilians are in charge. That's the way it should be.
Yeah, and I think the hope for most people is that after the war, the government will say, okay, we see how crucial it was for the civilians to join the army because the size of the army grew during the war. It's not just people that were already part of the army that are fighting today. There were massive recruitment drives that targeted civilians, especially young men, to join the fight. And we feel because of this, because these are people that traditionally have politics opposed to the army, opposed to the military junta rules of Sudan. We feel these people are going to hold some influence, to hold some sway on Burhan, and that he can swiftly arrange elections, and that the country can finally get back on the right path. And it can finally have a civil democratic state like we all wanted.
Perfect. Sounds amazing. Thank you for that final thought there. That's really something positive to lead us with that. The people who have joined up to fight have the power now, and they will use that power to hold the leadership accountable and make sure the transitionary government, that is the transitionary council in charge right now, that they'll actually be transitioning over to a civilian government. Well, I have one final thought. I want to thank both of my guests here for giving us theirs. My final thought is if you enjoyed this, you should like and subscribe, and go ahead and comment down below what your favorite little factoid, what your favorite piece of new information you got from this video was. As always, I'm your host, Chad X. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Goodbye.
Bye, guys.